Hello, my name is Roger Watson and welcome to this session on the endocrine system. First of all, about the endocrine system. The glands of the endocrine system and the hormones they release influence almost every cell, organ and function of our bodies. The endocrine system is instrumental in regulating mood, growth and development, tissue function and metabolism, as well as sexual function and reproductive processes. Before you begin, it might be well worth looking at this Bozeman Biology YouTube link on the endocrine system. And here are the glands of the endocrine system, from top of the body down to the bottom. The pineal, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the thyroid, the parathyroids, the thymus, the adrenals and the pancreas. We'll look at the function of all those, and they are all common to both men and women. And then we have the ovary in women and the testes in men, which are responsible for sexual development and for secondary sexual characteristics and also for sexual function. Of course, they're unique to men and women, ovaries in men, testes in women. We're not going to look in great detail at the functions of the reproductive hormones or the reproductive tract here. That will be the subject of another session. So starting at the top. The pineal glands are located deep in the brain between the cerebral hemispheres. And this diagram shows the position of the pineal gland. The pineal gland secretions are melatonin, and melatonin plays some part in sexual development, metabolism, sleep, but the precise functions are not very well understood, and it is secreted in synchronization with circadian rhythms. That's the rhythm between day and night. So melatonin is used as an alternative therapy, with some evidence that it helps in overcoming jet lag, but that evidence is not very strong. Next, the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, as the name suggests, is located below the thalamus of the brain, at the base of the brain, and it plays a major role in the maintenance of the internal environment in two main ways: by nervous system reflexes and through the endocrine system. And this diagram shows the position of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, or the hypothalamic secretions, are hormones carried in the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system to the anterior pituitary, which we'll come to next. Now, this rather complex diagram shows the relationship between the hypothalamus, marked at the top right, and the anterior pituitary, shown here as the adenohypophysis, as it's also known at the bottom left. Neural input from the higher regions of the brain lead to secretion of neurosecretory hormones, and these are secreted out into a unique part of the bloodstream, into the hypophyseal portal vessel, and this forms part of the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. And those hormones in turn stimulate the anterior pituitary to release other hormones which stimulate other parts of the body. The neurohypophysis, or the posterior pituitary, is directly innervated by upper regions of the brain. So the pituitary as a whole receives input which is mediated by hormones into the anterior part and neurally into the posterior part. So the hypothalamic secretions include corticotrophin-releasing hormone, thyrotrophin-releasing hormone, growth hormone-releasing hormone and growth hormone release-inhibiting hormone, prolactin-releasing hormone and prolactin release-inhibiting hormone, gonadotrophin-releasing hormone, melanocyte-stimulating releasing hormone and melanocyte-stimulating release-inhibiting hormone. Those names are all entirely self-explanatory, and we will come to all of the hormones subsequently in the session: the corticotrophins, the thyrotrophins, growth hormones, prolactin and gonadotrophin hormones. And melanocyte is responsible for the darkening pigment of the skin in response to sunlight, so we won't come back to that again. That's part of the protective mechanism against UV light. So next we'll come to the pituitary hormone, which responds to these releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones released by the hypothalamus. Pituitary gland controls a wide range of homeostatic, metabolic and developmental functions, and it's divided into three lobes: the anterior, which we've met, the middle lobe and the posterior lobe. And here's the position of the pituitary gland, and note its position in relation to the hypothalamus. And again, a rather complicated diagram, but this shows the anterior and the posterior lobes of the pituitary. The middle lobe doesn't seem to play any important function, so we won't cover that. And what you see on all of these diagrams are the various hormones that are released by the different parts of the pituitary. Don't worry, we'll come back to each of these in turn. It also shows you the tissues that they act upon. So from the anterior pituitary we have the gonadotrophins, which are follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, growth hormone, prolactin, which acts on the breast, the adrenocorticotrophins, which act on the adrenal cortex, and the thyroid stimulating hormone. The names are all self-explanatory and the tissues are shown. And then from the posterior pituitary we have antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin acts on the breast tissue and also on the uterus. So we'll go through each of these in turn. The adrenocorticotropic hormones increase the levels of glucocorticoid hormone and aldosterone in the body. Again, we'll come back to looking at what these do in other sections. Thyroid stimulating hormone increases the level of thyroid hormone secretion. Growth hormone stimulates growth factor secretion. Prolactin stimulates the development of the breasts, particularly in women. And luteinizing hormone stimulates the development of the ovaries and the testes. So from the anterior lobe of the pituitary we have the adrenocorticotropic hormones, thyroid stimulating hormone, growth hormone, prolactin and the gonadotrophins, which are composed of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. So what do each of these do? Next, the thyroid glands. The thyroid glands are located wrapped around the trachea, and there are two lobes just below the larynx. Thyroid hormones include thyroxine, which controls metabolic rate. Overproduction of thyroxine leads to a very high metabolic rate, leads to someone who's very thin, very nervous, very excitable and hyperactive. As we see in the thyroid gland disorder, hyperthyroidism, also known as Graves' disease. And here's somebody with Graves' disease, and those bulging eyes or exophthalmia are a classic sign of Graves' disease. We can also have underproduction of thyroid gland hormones, such as in hypothyroidism or in a condition called myxedema. And this leads to the opposite. It leads to extreme lethargy and to weight gain. And that's a picture of somebody with myxedema. So the middle lobe, which we haven't paid much attention to, secretes melanocyte-stimulating hormone. The posterior lobe secretes oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin encourages contraction of smooth muscle that's released during childbirth to encourage contraction of the uterus, and it's often administered after childbirth to encourage the expulsion of the placenta. Antidiuretic hormone decreases the loss of water by the kidneys, as the name suggests, by increasing reabsorption of water. Worth noting that antidiuretic hormone is inhibited by cold weather and alcohol, which both often lead to a feeling of urgently needing to use the toilet. It has the opposite effect of antidiuretic hormone. So control of pituitary gland secretions is by a mechanism we've already met called negative feedback. Take the example of thyroid hormones. The hypothalamus releases TRH, or thyrotrophic releasing hormone. This stimulates the pituitary to release TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid to release thyroid hormones. Shown here is T3 and T4, which are two slightly different versions of thyroxine, which is the thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is then carried in the blood bound to proteins, but there's an equilibrium between the free hormone and the bound hormone. And the higher the levels of the free hormone in the blood, the more this will inhibit the pituitary from releasing further TSH hormone. So it's a classic example of negative feedback. The levels of free hormone in the blood regulate the stimulation of the thyroid gland. Next, the parathyroid glands. As the name suggests, these are associated with the thyroids, but the functions are entirely different. The parathyroid glands are found behind the thyroid gland, and there are 4 of them, 2 in each lobe. Next, we look at the parathyroid gland secretions. First of all, we need to take into account calcitonin, which is actually released by the thyroid gland, and this increases calcium reabsorption from the blood and therefore lowers blood calcium levels. This works in opposition to parathyroid hormone, which is released by the parathyroid glands, and this decreases calcium reabsorption from the blood and increases calcium blood levels. So these two hormones work together to regulate the blood level of calcium. First of all, on the left there, if calcium levels rise above a set point, the thyroid gland releases calcitonin and the blood calcium levels fall. If the calcium levels fall below a set point, the parathyroid gland releases parathyroid hormone and the blood calcium levels rise. A classic homeostatic mechanism. Next, the thymus. This is a very poorly understood gland, located between the upper lobes of the lung. What does the thymus do? Nobody really knows. It shrinks as we develop to maturity. May have something to do with the development of the immune system. Next, the adrenal glands. As the name suggests, the adrenal glands lie above the kidneys. Kidneys are part of the renal system and they lie above it. The adrenal gland is a compact organ and it's composed of a medulla in the middle and a cortex on the outer part. These both release hormones, but these parts of the adrenal gland have very different functions. The adrenal gland secretions consist of, from the adrenal cortex, the mineralocorticoids, the glucocorticoids, and the sex hormones, which are the androgens in men and the estrogens in women, mainly. And the adrenal medulla secretes adrenaline, also known in North America as epinephrine, and noradrenaline, which is known as norepinephrine. So we'll look at what these hormones stimulate. Well, they stimulate the adrenal cortical hormones, the adrenocorticotrophins. These are the glucocorticoids and aldosterone. Glucocorticoids help to control glucose metabolism. They suppress inflammation and they are released in stress. Aldosterone controls sodium and water uptake. And aldosterone works on the renal system, and we will look at the renal system in a subsequent session. Sometimes we get an insight into how hormones work by looking at various disorders, and adrenal cortical hormone disorders include Cushing's disease and Cushing's syndrome. Cushing's disease results from overproduction of and long exposure to cortisol, and Cushing's syndrome arises in long-term corticosteroid therapy. And that's an example of the Cushing's syndrome or Cushing's disease. It gives you something called moon face. This is due to differential deposition of fat and also to retention of water in the body. Another cortical hormone disorder is hyperaldosteronism, which leads to high blood pressure and to low sodium levels in the blood. Leads to weakness, muscle spasms and paralysis. First of all, let's look at adrenaline and noradrenaline, which are released in the fight or flight reaction. In fact, these are released in response to sympathetic stimulation. You'll remember the sympathetic nervous system from the session on the brain and the central nervous system. They increase heart rate and they increase blood pressure. So if you are suddenly frightened, you experience something called the fight or flight reaction. The adrenaline gets you ready to fight or prepares you to run away. It increases your heart rate, helps your breathing, helps your circulation. You can see it here in this dog on the right hand side when the dog on the left makes an unwanted advance towards it. Next, the pancreas. The pancreas is intimately associated with the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine, and we'll come back to that when we look at the digestive system. Here we just want to look at the pancreas specifically. The pancreas has exocrine functions and endocrine functions. Exocrine functions mean that substances are secreted out of the body, in this case into the digestive tract, and that's the release of digestive enzymes, which we'll come back to on the sessions on the digestive tract. And it also has endocrine functions, and these are concerned with the regulation of blood sugar levels. So the pancreatic secretions regulate blood sugar levels, and the hormones that are released there are released from the islets of Langerhans, from the alpha cells and the beta cells respectively. We have the release of glucagon, which increases blood sugar levels, and insulin, which decreases blood sugar levels. So these act in a classic homeostatic mechanism to regulate blood sugar levels. A lack of insulin, if it's from early onset, it's called type 1. If it's late onset, it's called type 2. But a lack of insulin is known as diabetes, and this leads to an inability to regulate blood sugar levels adequately. It also has many other unwanted side effects. Next, we'll have a brief look at the ovaries and the testes. First of all, the ovaries. And these are intimately associated with the uterus in the female and located at the ends of the fallopian tube. The ovaries secrete eggs into the fallopian tube and down into the uterus in preparation for fertilization and childbirth. Here we're just concerned with the secretions, which include estrogen and progesterone. And these control ovulation and fertility and secondary female sex characteristic development. The testes in men are located outside the abdomen, just below the penis. And the testes, in addition to secreting sperm cells, also secrete testosterone, which leads to muscle, bone and secondary male sex characteristic development. The testosterone leads to the typical male characteristics. So the endocrine system, just to revise, the glands of the endocrine system and the hormones they release influence almost every cell, organ and function of our bodies. The endocrine system is instrumental in regulating mood, growth and development, tissue function and metabolism, as well as sexual function and reproductive processes. So finally, some questions. 1. In addition to mood and reproduction, name 4 things that the endocrine system controls. 2. What do the pineal glands secrete, and what 3 aspects of the body is this secretion related to? 3. Where is the hypothalamus located? Which endocrine gland does it control, and in what 2 ways does the hypothalamus control this gland? 4. What is the collective name for the 2 systems that take chemical and nervous signals to the pituitary, and what are the 3 lobes of the pituitary? 5. In addition to the gonadotrophins, name 4 other anterior pituitary secretions. 6. What are the 2 secretions of the posterior pituitary gland, and give 1 function of each. 7. Give 3 functions of glucocorticoids and 1 function of aldosterone. 8. What is secreted by the thyroid gland, what does it do, and what is overproduction and underproduction of this hormone called, respectively. 9. What hormone is released by the parathyroid glands, and what does it do? Which hormone released by the thyroid gland has the opposite effect? 10. What are the 2 secretions of the adrenal medulla, and name 2 of their actions? 11. Name the 2 secretions of the islets of Langerhans and what their respective actions are. And finally 12, name the female and male gonads and name the secretions of the female gonads. Thank you very much for listening. This is my email if you have any comments or questions. All the answers to these questions will be found on my blog, 4 Things About, A Simple Approach to Anatomy and Physiology, under the entry, The Endocrine System. Once again, thank you very much.